Well, what we choose to believe in is a really interesting thing, from the trad religions to the X-Files conspiracy theories. You could argue it's human to look for answers to the big question, what the hell are we doing here? Whatever you believe, the bottom line is you shouldn't force other people to believe it if they think it's a load of crap. Unfortunately, there are a number of sects operating out there that want to suck you in and indoctrinate you into their view of the world. This hour, we're talking to a sect survivor who now campaigns against the very thing that he did sell to other people. Troy Waller was a member of a Christian sect called the Revival Centres, a Christian sect God-bothering at a university campus near you. Troy, welcome to Triple J. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How did you join the Revival Centre?
Well, basically, I had a friend of mine at school, and I was about 13 years old, and he had a Commodore 64 and also access to a large amount of lollies, and we just became friends, and it turns out he was involved in the group, and he invited me on a camp, and sort of typical cult, mechanism. They sort of whisked me away for 2 weeks, and I came back well and truly indoctrinated and a part of the Revival Centres.
And the word you call the Revival Centres a cult, which conjures up terrible images for people.
Yeah, sure. People, when you say cult, people usually think of some sort of extreme group like David Koresh and his Branch Davidians and setting fire to a compound or something like that. But cult is, a term that we use to sort of define a destructive religious group or a group with a belief that is sort of in opposition to the mainstream sort of thought. So cult is not necessarily always a bad term, but in the sense of a destructive group, yes. And, they operate within Australia, within mainstream Australian society, but they're usually closed communities within that sort of broader community.
So what do the Revival Centres teach?
Well, basically, they're highly racist in that they have this belief that the lost tribes of Israel are actually the Anglo-Saxon people, so they have a sort of white supremacist position, and they're very anti-Semitic as well, in that they think that the Jews are sort of a bastardised race. So that underlies sort of everything that they believe, but their main tenet, or what they really push and what distinguishes them from other religions in this country, is primarily that you must speak in tongues and also be a member of their church to be saved. So if you're not a member of their church, if you don't speak in tongues, then chances are you're going to go to hell and you're not part of the elite.
So what attracted you, Troy?
Well, I guess, I was sort of an ideological young kid, and I guess in a lot of ways I still am, quite idealistic, but they play with your ego to some degree, that if you join their group, you have been enlightened, you come into this family or this group that are superior and above everybody else. We have the truth, there's a whole social network that you get drawn into, and there's a lot of positive aspects to it, or at least appealing aspects.
But didn't your sense of justice, when you first went to a meeting and they started telling you that you have to be white to be one of the chosen people, and
well, you don't so much have to be white to be one of the chosen people, but if you are white, you're more chosen, would be a better way to put it.
But didn't you prick up your ears and think, hang on, when you first heard those things? Or you did think you were quite young? And
Yeah, I think part of it was youth. I think my sense of justice actually was tweaked when I started seeing the way that they treated former members, that we were, told to cut ourselves off, which is typically cultic, because that's got to do with information control. And so just the way that people were mercilessly kicked out of the group and we were told to have nothing to do with them, that's really what started getting me going. And I was lucky in that my family were never part of the group. So I had something that I could sort of compare to. I had this sense of mainstream thought that I'd go home to, whereas a lot of people in the group, especially the kids, have been brought up in it, don't have that, and that's why they're still there and I'm out, I guess.
So in terms of it being a revival centre, you mentioned the talking in tongues. We'll get to that in a second, but how did you worship? Did you have to go to church, say, 3 times a week, or have Bible readings? How did you...
Well, a typical...
What was the practices?
Yeah, well, an unmarried or under 25 sort of age person would be expected to go to a house meeting in the middle of the week, which is someone's house, then hence house meeting. Then Saturday night you'd be expected to go to what they call young people's, which is, the youth group style thing. Then Sundays you're expected to go to 2 meetings on Sunday, and after that your social networks etc. are all sort of tied in with the church, and if you started to drift, well then you'd get a phone call, you'd get a knock on your door, sort of wondering where you were. So there was a very high expectation that you attended all these meetings.
And what did you do? Imagine. What did you do at the meetings? Was it fun? Was it sitting around chatting? Were you reading the Bible? What did you do?
Well, it depends. Like the house meeting was, sort of someone to get up there and sort of give a bit of an indoctrination spiel and just sort of go over all the beliefs or whatever, and, we just sort of reinforce, to each other, yes, that this is what we believe. And then the youth meetings, I must admit, the youth meetings were a lot of fun. We used to go, have sports nights and all that sort of thing, or go to the movies or whatever it was that we'd do. And that was always a lot of fun. And I think that was one of the main draw cards for the group. And then Sundays was sort of imagine a sort of 1950s religious, sort of American Pentecostal religious service. It was very similar to that. Sing a few hymns, sing a few choruses, clap your hands, listen to a really boring sermon, take communion, and then they'd operate what they call the spiritual gifts, which is where someone would speak out in tongues, and then someone would in turn interpret that tongue, and then other people would give prophecies which they believed were from God. But basically it was the same thing every week, sort of we're the only right ones and don't turn to the left or to the right and all this sort of thing. And that was supposedly God speaking to us.
Right, so speaking in tongues is when God's speaking through you, is it?
Well, that's what the revival centres would teach, although I would tend to think it was, very different. Obviously, doing some study on this, which is what I'm doing at Monash at the moment, you tend to have to look at it through, sociological eyes and psychological eyes, as well as also trying to look at it through eyes of faith. So I believe that, perhaps there is a spiritual gift called tongues that perhaps God gives, but at the same time, I also believe that this can be induced, psychologically taught. People can be pressured into sort of, and induced into making this sort of gibberish, etc. So I try to take a middle ground, so sort of looking at it through eyes of the spiritual eyes and saying this could in fact be something mystical, but at the same time, I'm very aware of studies that have been done that have proven that this can be a learned behaviour. Right.
Well, it happens in a number of religions. With the sect that you were a member of, would anyone just go into it all of a sudden, or did you have to be anointed? Like it's your turn to speak in tongues today, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. How you got the gift, which is, when I think back on this, it's really quite scary. I was 13 years old and I spent 2 hours in the pastor's, or the leader's, minister's cabin on this camp, saying hallelujah over and over and over again until I spoke in tongues. Now, as you can imagine, you could say fried egg, or John Paul, George and Ringo 3 times faster and your tongue will start to go funny as well. So basically by saying hallelujah over and over and over, eventually my tongue changed, and that's called the gift of tongues.
What's it sound like?
Oh, it just sounds like a sort of a gibberish. I hope you're not going to try and get me to do it, because I don't. But
I'd love to hear it.
Oh, well, I don't sort of do that. But, yeah, look, it just sounds like gibberish. It's not proof of anything. And as you said, it's, like there's different religions and different sects and both Christian and Hindu and even Islamic that actually have what's called glossolalia or ecstatic utterances. So it's really not proof of anything, because you've got all these people with sort of opposing and differing beliefs all doing it. It's not testimony of anything being true or right.
Now, a lot of people, when they think of sects or cults, they think of lots of recruitment. Did you have to recruit other new members, and how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, I brought a few people in, and thankfully I've also helped bring them out. And as my brother said at my wedding some years ago, he said, for years Troy spent his time trying to get me into the revival centres, and now he spends all his time trying to get people out. There was we would have a coffee shop that we ran in the city, and we would, as a youth group, all be sent out with little tickets inviting people, through the city to come back to the coffee shop. We're expected to try and forge relationships with our friends at school purely on the basis of trying to get them in. But if those people started drawing us out, well, then we'd cut them off. So there was a very high drive for recruitment, and I must say that the Revival Centres movement, which is sort of split into all these different factions nowadays, have a very high recruitment rate, and I would say they're probably one of the most active cults in Australia.
And how do they get people in? What attracts people? When a lot of people come up to you and invite you for coffee to talk about God, I know most people go, look, no, really, I'm quite busy and I can't do that at the moment. Why was your group so successful?
Well, most people do that, but some people don't. And, it's just the law of averages or the law of odds, I guess. Eventually you're going to hit someone that is seeking or is looking for some sort of spiritual expression. And that's what the cult does. You see, I'm very much for freedom of belief and freedom of religion. If anybody wants to believe anything, that's their business. And I really want to stress that I'm not opposed to the Revival Centre's belief system as such. But when that group starts to exploit people's spiritual expression or spiritual desires to control them and manipulate them, and to force them to act according to certain behaviours or belief systems, well, that's when I start to have a problem. And
were you told to target kids who were lonely and looking for love, perhaps?
No, but you would by default.
Right.
You weren't told to do that, but, especially a lot of people being that sort of person themselves, come to know what sort of people would perhaps respond to a revival centre thing. When you get them in, when people would come in, they would automatically feel sort of the love bombing thing. They'd be treated very special. They're like a new baby, so to speak, within the organisation, and they're new blood, and so everyone gets around them and gets really excited about them and makes them feel really special and welcome. But after a little while, that sort of dries up, and that's when the control, and it's very easy to act according to the behaviours when you're being love bombed, but when that dries up, that's when they start to enforce it through maybe not so friendly, special styles of control.
And why don't they just keep the love bombing up?
Well, you can't do that forever. No one can love anyone forever.
We're talking to Troy Waller on Triple J. He was a member of a Christian sect called the Revival.